Today we're talking about life in the 1860s for the better off. And for this we're going to use a story out of Godey's called A Nice Neighborhood. There was a plain dish of mutton chops for dinner at home that night, with turnips and potatoes, a bread pudding for dessert. Mr. Ballard always advocated a plain table. It was part of his general principle in life, moderation in all expenses, no pinching in one place to spare another. He had started without capital, and it was his ambition to accumulate one, not for the mere pride of which men take in a good bank account, but because opportunities were constantly occurring for the advancement of his business depended upon his ability to control ready money. Mr. Ballard was in the leather trade. Thus far, Mrs. Ballard had entered into the understanding very heartily, and had endeavored not to overstep the income he had allowed for himself, any more than it had been a salary, with not the possibility of enlarging it. They were married for a couple of years, but no children yet. The trouble started when Mrs. Ballard wanted to move to a new house in such a nice neighborhood. The new house was only $100 a year more, which is about $8 1/3 a month more. Remember that the national average rent for a 6-room dwelling is $6 a month, but these are 3-floor brownstones in New York City, with a 3rd room on the 1st floor and 2 more chambers above. Mr. Ballard isn't sure why they need more sleeping apartments when they already had 4 and used only 1. But they have at least 2 live-in servants, a cook, and the waiter, attendant I think, who was a chambermaid and co-laundress. Apparently the servants' sleeping rooms don't count. I'm guessing they lived in the unmentioned 3rd floor. They moved with little expense. The new parlor carpet would have been needed anyway, and the furniture being almost new was sufficiently good for its present improved quarters. After 2 new and stylish neighbors visit, a friend from the old neighborhood visits. When the familiar black beaver bonnet and gray Siberian fur tippet made their appearance in her parlors, she even wondered how she could have thought Mrs. Thane pretty and ladylike. Mrs. Ballard sat sewing again the next morning, her dress a printed mousseline de laine, her feet shod in gaiters that had seen some service and neatly darned on the side, answered very well for the house. She wore a plain linen set, and in fact would have unhesitatingly have gone out with Mrs. Thane any morning just as she was. There was a ring at the doorbell. Her best dress, a Marie Louise blue silk, her best hat, her new velvet cloak, new gaiters, and of course her best set of muslins were laid out so she could go out with her neighbor. 2 days later the other new neighbor stops by. She was tempted to put on her brown merino, her usual walking dress, but then the velvet and merino did not look well together, and her old cloth cloak was so shabby, and Mrs. wore a rich robe dress in 3 flounces, so the blue silk went on again, just for this once, with all of its accompaniments. Mrs. Ballard had her modest list of necessary articles to be purchased. It was her methodical habit to set down everything as it made herself known, so that when she took an afternoon for shopping, she usually accomplished a great deal. But she did not think it polite to move away from Mrs., or to ask her to leave her elegancy she was so absorbed in inspecting, for the plain glass towels and vulgar crash which she happened to need. To the toweling and crash, which had not been purchased yet, sewing silk and various other little items were now added. It was necessary to make an exhibition to that fated region of delays, downtown. This time alone, and being alone there was no excuse for finery, but it had become a matter of habit, and as though her second best silk, a well-preserved plaid, replaced the blue one, which had been torn on the door of an omnibus on the last trip, it allowed velvet and the best bonnet, both of which were put on. In addition to wearing her finery, Mrs. Ballard takes up other habits. Mr. Ballard now and then indulged his wife in a concert or an evening at the theater, and an ice cream at some tidy saloon afterwards, as much as the fashion with a quiet Cockney husband's. But to go at midday and by herself into a crowded Broadway restaurant Mrs. Ballard never dreamed of doing. The utmost limit of her shopping lunches had been a modest purchase at some cake shop, eating a jumble or a square of sponge cake over the counter as she waited to have her parcel tied up. After all, a mutton chop at home tastes better than turtle soup at Delmonico's, said Mr. Ballard, applying himself cheerfully to the delicacy he mentioned. You don't get potatoes boiled like this at a restaurant either. Mealy as a miller, as he surveyed the pomme de terre on the end of his fork. Lem Gilbert wanted me to stop in at Delmonico's as I came up to town. His treat, of course, but then I should have been obliged to return some day. And when I have any money to spend, I like to spend it on my little life to enjoy it with her. But her new friends visit a cafe on each shopping trip, and when it comes time for her to return the favor, they decide. There's nothing finer than broiled oysters and woodcock, after all. Entirely unconscious of the charge for this selected delicacy, Mrs. Ballard gave her order to the waiter with an ease and confidence that surprised herself. It was well that she had taken an extra $3 bill from the house money that morning. How much change she received from it at the desk, or rather, how little, she did not care to examine into. And then there was the French dressmaker. And her charges are frightful. I had my last bill 6 weeks before I dare showed it to Mr. Sloane. $70 for 3 dresses. But it's the garniture was the difficulty. They always find the trimmings, and they can charge you anything they like on those without being able to say one word. I thought you might like to be introduced. She never undertakes a customer without introduction. And note, the fabric was provided to the dressmaker. Mr. Ballard notices a change. She no longer brought her account books to be added up and boasted playfully of her good management in money matters. She was irritable. "I'm afraid you don't go out enough. You ought to walk every day," pursued Mr. Ballard. "But Fred," began Mrs. Ballard with a confession trembling on her lips. Yes, I know all about the sewing and housekeeping. I have the most industrious and economical life in the world, but for all that you must take time to keep well." Later, the little household that had always run like clockwork began to show symptoms of disarrangement. Dinner was late, there was little variety, beefsteak 3 times a week as often as not, and no more little dishes which Mrs. Ballard used to be so famous for concocting. And cold meat, which he hated, took their place 2 nights in succession. Mr. Ballard naturally redemonstrated and was told sharply that it must be used up some way, and she had no time to waste in the kitchen. He overheard his usually gentle wife berating the cook for using the best linen pillowcases on her bed, and the cook retorted that the cotton was all gived out and she wasn't going to sleep on a tick for nobody. Surely he remembered giving his wife money for the purchase of new bedding for the servants' room when they moved into the house, and helping her measure off a set of pillowcases. His memory was correct. He would have found the whole set in her work basket if he looked there, with only the overs and overseams finished. It was sad enough, the step-by-step of little extravagances, little concealments, and practiced deceits, which led to the taking of money he had missed to replace the wardrobe ruined in the frequent idle shopping excursions and wasted on delicacies which her husband so strictly denied himself, or in the purchase of expensive items of dress she had been drawn into purchasing from the example of her new acquaintances. "You did not stay long at 37th Street, Mr. Cameron said to his friend when congratulating him on the happy occurrence of the new baby. "I was surprised when I heard you move. It was such a nice neighborhood." "Yes, very nice," said Mr. Ballard, hesitating a moment. Perhaps Mr. Cameron thought of taking his new wife there. How should he convey a sort of warning? "A very nice neighborhood, but I don't think an altogether healthy one." So just how better off were these folks? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but there is one clue in this story, that one of the other husbands is a bank cashier. In the employments of women, a Cyclopedia of Women's Work, the bank clerk makes somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000. She also mentions that this would not support a family in any city of the United States without rigid economy. The reason I believe she says this is because bank clerks were expected to pretty much be part of the upper class, and that is sort of a tough wage because it's really at the bottom of the upper class, as you can see on this graph. So I suspect that our 2 families are somewhere between the 5 and 20%, not the super wealthy at the 1% or the 2 to 5%, but somewhere here in the upper class, not middle class down here or the lower class at the bottom 40%. Now, our Ballards, I think, are sort of at the cusp between very upper middle class bleeding into upper class, but they're obviously quite conservative spending, so that makes a difference. Hopefully you find this story interesting to shed more light on how the better off lived during the 1860s. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye.